I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. I want to thank you all for joining us for this conversation on how newsrooms are reassessing newsworthiness and trying to balance crime coverage specifically when confronted with individual privacy interests. Many thanks to the New England Newspaper and Press Association for providing this forum for us to discuss this timely and I think increasingly relevant topic. It's a topic that's being discussed more and more in news organizations throughout the country, and it raises a lot of important questions about the public's right to know, journalistic obligations, and how newsrooms can best be a positive force in the communities that they cover. So we don't have a whole lot of time here. Let's start with some very brief introductions. Joining us today, we have Sarah Collins. Sarah's a journalist and a documentary filmmaker. While studying at Columbia, Sarah extensively researched right to be forgotten programs such as those that we'll discuss today. She's going to be providing us a lot of valuable context about these programs and giving some best practices and tips for anyone in a newsroom that's considering such a program. Also with us is Dan McLeod. Dan's managing editor at the Bangor Daily News. Dan's going to describe for us his paper's own efforts to respond to a growing number of readers who are looking to have stories about them updated, edited, or perhaps even removed. And similarly, we have Jason Tuohy, editor at bostonglobe.com and part of the Boston Globe's Fresh Start initiative. That initiative allows readers to request certain crime stories that they're involved in be updated or, in rare cases, removed if they're no longer newsworthy or causing some kind of reputational harm. Both Dan and Jason will give us some more details about their respective programs shortly. But first, I'd like to begin with Sarah. Sarah, if you could, can you give us a good overview of these issues that have prompted these types of programs? You know, what are newsrooms throughout the country doing generally, and what particular issues are they looking to address?
Sure. So I guess I'll start first by explaining the name. So the name, if people aren't familiar, comes from the GDPR European law, actually, that basically allows European citizens to request that private companies remove data about them. And so it's sort of interesting that journalism picked up this name because obviously it's not legally bound, and I think it would be in pretty direct conflict with our First Amendment. But the idea kind of is sort of similar where, you know, newsrooms got this idea, or maybe have been unofficially doing this for a long time, that, you know, some stories that have this kind of longevity on the internet might not actually be still relevant to readers and to society. So, you know, back in the old days, you would throw away a newspaper at the end of the day. And if you really wanted to look it up, you could go to the library, look at microfiche, things like that. But now, you know, thanks to the internet, for better or worse, you can take 2 seconds to type in something on Google and, you know, something from years earlier can pop up. So, you know, while that's useful in a lot of ways for maybe more private citizens who had maybe a one-off arrest, or, you know, maybe there was an incorrect article that came out about them that could really, you know, potentially be damaging to their careers, to their personal lives, et cetera. So some newsrooms, you know, were getting these requests and kind of decided to formalize it. And I believe that Cleveland.com in Ohio obviously was the first sort of public-facing newsroom about this, to say, you know, hey, we realize that the technology is different now than it was when we first started. So we are offering this program to allow folks to submit, you know, requests and provide proof. For example, you know, if you say, oh, my record has been sealed, you know, if you provide proof to show that it has indeed been sealed, then, you know, we can take a look at it and review it and maybe take it down or anonymize it. So now more and more newsrooms, including Bangor Daily News and Boston Globe, are, you know, jumping on board with this. The processes vary by newsroom. So, you know, some have like the more formal process like Cleveland.com. Some are kind of just doing it on a more informal basis, you know, just send us an email or whatever. And yep, I'm sure that Jason and Dan can talk about the specifics of their newsrooms.
Yeah, so Dan, let's start with the Bangor Daily News. You know, as Sarah mentioned, not all of these programs are created in the same way. Different newsrooms are approaching these issues in different ways. How's the Bangor Daily News? How's your newsroom approaching this issue, and what does your program specifically look like?
You know, for as long as I've been at the BDN, I've been here for 6 years. I've been the editor for about 3. You get steady requests from folks who, you know, got written about or were included in some list of indictments in like the early 2000s or something like that. They never did anything else. And it's just sort of this one link has just been following them their whole lives. And our policy in the past was just, well, we don't unpublish stuff because why would we? We're newspapers. It's not a thing we do, you know? So in some cases, what we would do is we would publish a follow-up saying, by the way, this person was acquitted, or, you know, we would add a note to the story saying like, this person was acquitted, here's a link to the news story, or, you know. A couple of years ago, I felt like we were getting more of them. We're starting to think about, is there a more organized way we can do this? And is this actually, you know, do we have a role in reducing the harm that we're causing people because of just the dominance of Google and the fact that people can't escape these links? So we didn't really have the technology that would allow us to remove it from Google. We could only unpublish it, which we still weren't really willing to do. Just because we believe that there's a historical record, and for like newsrooms, you know, we want our reporters to be able to look up somebody, you know, look up clips if they need to, you know, someone who was arrested for, I don't know, you know, drunken driving and crashing into a Dunkin' Donuts, maybe runs for city council 10 years later, you know. So we moved to a new site last year, which gave us some more sophisticated back-end tools and allows us to actually unindex stories from Google. So that's what we based our policy around, was that if you have a story from, in the case of if it's a misdemeanor, 5 years, or if it's more serious, 10 years, we will review your story and, if necessary, unindex it from Google so that it doesn't show up in search results anymore. We rolled this out in January, and we got a lot of good responses. It didn't get very many people actually taking advantage of it so far. Actually, mostly all of the times that I've done this has been more informally in the lead up to it. But our policy is that, like, we don't do this with people who are, you know, public figures. We don't do it if it's like a very serious crime against children, if you got like a long track record of serious crimes. And, you know, we leave it up to us to decide whether we take it down. So it's not hard and fast rules. Yeah, and we set it at 5 years for a misdemeanor, and 10 years for more serious crimes, because that's what the main court system does. They destroy documents after that period of time. So it was a handy deadline for us. And that's where it came from.
Jason, how about the Boston Globe's Fresh Start initiative? Is it similar to what colleagues are doing at Bangor Daily News? Are you taking a different approach? What kind of criteria or process do you have in place for your readers?
It's a very, it's similar to what Dan has described. And I think this is something that a lot of newsrooms have been wrestling with kind of separately and independently for a few years now. The Boston Globe, like other places, we've received these requests for many years now. People with stories about, there was a story written years ago. It's still on your website. Every time you Google me, this is the one thing that comes up, and I kind of can't escape it. And, really people making the plea that this was a minor incident in my past. I don't think that this should be the one thing that defines me for the rest of my life. And we would always deal with these requests when they came in, but we dealt with them kind of as one-offs, addressing the sort of specific situation at hand, but we did not have a larger program or standards or guidelines. And so the past couple of years, we had been talking really specifically about how we could launch something bigger and sort of, more systematic to address these requests. Following the killing of George Floyd, the Globe, like many newsrooms, took a look at our standards and practices sort of across the board. And it felt like now was a good time to really sort of launch into this and create a program and really publicize what would end up becoming Fresh Start. To give you a little more background too, and a couple of people on the panel have already alluded to this, but in some ways, with Fresh Start, what we're attempting to change or address are sort of technology and circumstances beyond our control. We've covered crime and other sort of types of minor stories for literally over 100 years here at the Globe. But it's only in recent years that the power of search engines have turned something that used to be kind of back of the metro section, would run for a day, but then would be tossed in the recycling bin and kind of forgotten about. You would really have to try to go find that story again. All of a sudden, the power of search engines makes it so it's linked to someone for the rest of time, really. You Google someone's name and that's what comes up, and there's no real way to escape that. And that was never the point of our journalism. It was, the goal was never to serve as a scarlet letter for someone and a barrier for them to kind of move on with their lives. And so that's kind of what we're trying to address here. The way Fresh Start works for us, it's a 10-person committee in the newsroom. We have a sign-up page and a form that someone can go to and fill out. They submit a request to have their case reviewed. The committee reviews every case we get. We don't act on all of them, but we will consider every case that is submitted to us. We have, a series of internal guidelines that we go through and just things we check before we come up with a decision. And then I think the other thing, and Dan references too, but it has to be submitted by an individual. We're not accepting requests from lawyers. We don't want to give someone an edge just because they have the financial resources to hire counsel. We're also not accepting requests from government agencies or corporations. I mean, that's not the point of this. This is really an attempt to help individuals who are affected by this. And so, it's still a fairly new program for us. We launched in January. We've received dozens of cases. And I think the one other thing I'd say is it's, we consider it a work in progress. This is new. This is something that's new to the entire industry. Cleveland.com has obviously been a leader in this front. But we're going to be flexible and adjust. We're going to take feedback from the community, and, we're going to be open to adjusting our process as we learn more and as we go through this.
Great. Thank you, Jason. And I want to get back to that process in a moment, but Dan, as a point of clarification, Jason mentioned that there's a committee at the Globe that's in charge of making decisions one way or the other when these requests come in. How does it work in your newsroom? Is it a similar committee? Do you have just a few individuals involved? Who ultimately makes the decision as to what's to be done, if anything, with a particular article?
Typically, it's just been me. My intent was to create a committee at some point once I've sort of standardized some of the other finer points about it, but there hasn't been like a flood recently that I thought required a bunch more people. Yeah, but no, that is the intent, to create a committee at some point.
Got it. And to those, the finer points, I know both you and Jason in your respective newsrooms are still working out some of the details and creating this program as you go. But are there any hard rules that you're operating by already? For example, one person in attendance here today is asking, does the policy, do you consider these requests regardless of court disposition? Or do you, for example, have a rule that, okay, this particular case or record needs to be expunged first, and we'll use that as a criteria in our considerations? What specifically, if anything, do you have as far as hard rules that you're operating by so far?
So if a case has been expunged or dismissed, and they can prove it, then that would be fine. Like if there's court documents, the really hard and fast rules are around sort of what we're not willing to do. And I think Jason kind of laid out, I think us and Cleveland and others that are doing this are pretty on the same board about, we're not doing this for corporations. This isn't about cleaning up your PR. It's about individual people moving on from their past mistakes. Yeah, I had an interesting case actually like last week that was really messy actually, where he didn't actually know about our program, but he was asking to have something changed. And it was like a 10-year-old story. And he wanted reference to him being on a sex offender list to be removed because he claims that back then he actually wasn't on a sex offender list. And it required him to dig up old documents and send them to me. And it was like 15 years ago or something like that. And I didn't take it down because while it may not, technically the crime that he committed wasn't a sex crime, or it wasn't something that gets you on the sex offender list. It did involve a crime against a child. but there was like this, but there is like these sort of like messy factual questions about like, were the authorities actually wrong back then or not? So there's some things that come up where I don't think that there's like a perfect solution, you know, and part of this is you're trying to figure it out. It's the same way that you're trying to figure it out as you're reporting out a story. I mean, you don't get it right every single time. I think the point is that we're trying to move on and generally help people move on from their past mistakes.
Yeah, and Jason, at the Globe, are there a couple, just hard rules that you're operating by that really determine how you proceed with these requests? What rules, if any, do you have right now as you continue to fine tune your program?
Well, I think one thing we've found throughout the program, and as we were designing it, is that we very much wanted to hear every case. We believe that everyone should at least be heard, regardless of whether or not we end up taking action. We wanted to provide that forum and that opportunity for people. And the more we looked into the issue, we did a lot of consultation with people in our community, community leaders and experts in a variety of fields, so that we weren't designing it, in a bubble. But one of our big takeaways coming out of that was that you really need to take it on a case-by-case basis, and that you couldn't be so rigid as to draw hard lines of saying, we're only going to look at misdemeanors and not going to consider felonies at all or anything like that. I mean, the more you actually dig into it and the more you look into cases, you see just how wildly different and specific each case was. So, we do have internal guidelines that we look at and sort of, almost like a decision tree we'll walk through to help the people looking at the cases make decisions and sort of ask the right questions. But, we are also very mindful that every person's story is their own and unique, and we need to take it on a case-by-case basis.
Sarah, to get back to you for a moment, is this similar to what you've been seeing in other newsrooms in New England or otherwise? Have they been taking similar approaches, keeping guidelines fairly, loose, looking at requests on an individual basis, as opposed to setting some very hard rules that that determine the program moving forward? What have you seen in your research?
Yeah, from what I've seen, and I've talked to folks across the country, it is usually pretty informal. I would say probably the Boston Globe actually has the most formal structure that I've spoken with. And so I think something that wasn't mentioned, I'm actually right now trying to come up with guidelines for newsrooms, loose guidelines, not like mandates or anything. And I do think, the Globe's approach of talking to folks in a bunch of different fields is really important, and especially the community, because you want to make sure that, I mean, I can go more into this later, but just that the stuff you're taking down is sort of proportional to the crimes being committed.
Jason and Dan, one question, and Sarah as well, from a general perspective, one thing that I've encountered with these types of programs, particularly given that they all seem to be lumped in under this broad label of right to be forgotten, is that those that are very much proponents of freedom of information, many journalists themselves who have been working under the philosophy of getting as much information out to the public and into communities as possible, when you hear that right to be forgotten label, I mean, given the programs that you described, it seems to be inaccurate, a misnomer. And wondering if the two of you have encountered any challenges trying to sell this program, if you will, to the communities that you serve, given that there might be a perception problem, and that people are going to hear what you're saying, see these programs, and think they're going to wake up in the morning and poof, all of these news stories that they've been relying on throughout the years are just suddenly gone and have vanished and can't be accessed by the public anymore. Have you had these types of conversations? And regardless, what would you say in response to those that have that type of concern regarding these types of programs? Jason, you want to begin, please?
I mean, it's a good question, and it's a valid question, and it's certainly one that we talk about a lot and balance it. I mean, just a couple factors to surface here. For these requests, one of the things we're really looking at is balancing the kind of continued newsworthiness of a story versus the harm being done to the individual, and I think it's very important, again, traditionally news organizations have looked at news in terms of what's news that day. When you start to talk about something that happened 8, 10 years ago, in a lot of these cases for minor sort of incidental events, the newsworthiness declines significantly over time. The damage and the harm done to the individual stays relatively constant over time. And that's a factor, and that's something we have to weigh. I also think, it's very important too to note, we're not erasing history here. The primary complaints and requests that we've heard over and over again from people is when you Google my name, this comes up first, and it's a very specific sort of subcase. Someone can still, as they always have been able to do, could go to the library, someone could go through archives, someone could go to LexisNexis and find these stories. We're not completely erasing them from history, and we're certainly, the Globe doesn't have the power to erase it from any other publication that may have covered it, to erase it from court records and things like that. There's a limit to what we can do, and we're, limited by our own reach. But I think we're mindful of solving that specific case of attaching this one minor incident to someone in such a way that it is available to anyone who has an internet connection for the rest of time.
Dan, have you heard of any of these concerns, perhaps maybe even from your own colleagues in the newsroom who have put in a tremendous amount of time reporting certain stories that they may find will soon be edited or de-indexed, or in rare cases removed? How do you respond to those that have some concerns about the process and the lack of accessibility the public may have to certain stories moving forward?
Well, I don't sense that there's a great demand for like our indictment list from January of 1997, or I keep talking about drunk people driving into Dunkin' Donuts. It's always my example of a small news story. But if there's not like a huge, people are not saying, hey, where did these stories go, or how come I can't read these stories from back then? These are largely stories that are of interest for a day or two and then are not. It's just like a weird function of Google that they maintain their relevance for 20 years afterwards. So no, it hasn't come up as an issue, and staff haven't seemed to be particularly concerned either. This is not something we would do on an investigation that takes weeks or months, or a big enterprise story, unless for some reason it was based on wrong information, which hasn't happened yet. So that's basically it. I definitely agree with Jason.
All right. And just as a point of clarification here, what are the options that are on the table when a reader comes to you and asks you to do something about a story that shows them in a negative light? Are you just simply de-indexing the story so it's not accessible through search engines? Are you updating the story with additional information, the result of a particular court case, for example? Or are you actually, in some cases, removing that story from your website entirely? What are the options that you're considering?
I have not. We're not removing the story entirely, in part because I wanted there to be a way for reporters and editors to at least have a searchable record that was easy to find, in case for some reason someone did become newsworthy again. The thing that we do is we de-index it from Google, which is ostensibly the same thing as, it basically solves the problem, because that's where a lot of this traffic is coming from, if there is any. We also have the option of removing old social media posts attached to that story if necessary. Although some of these stories are so old that they kind of predate, like Twitter was 2009, I think it started. So some of these stories are from like 2006. But yeah, we don't unpublish it, and it's largely just Google, which seems to be enough. We don't have a Bing strategy because it hasn't come up, because I think it's like 0.03% of our traffic comes from Bing or something like that. But yeah.
And Jason, at the Globe, are you taking down any stories, or is it mostly a matter of de-indexing and making them less findable through search engines?
A similar approach, the de-indexing or updating stories, with an editor's note. Those are two options. Another possibility for us is anonymizing a name in a story. And that can be for an incident in which maybe the story itself retains high news value, but the name featured in it, we deem no longer to be necessary to be sort of broadcast as widely as it is. And that could be something for, imagine a major protest that would have happened in downtown Boston or something where, the event itself is quite newsworthy and something you want to keep part of a historical record, but, the event of one individual named in there is sort of no longer important or is, negatively harming someone on the sort of search engine.
Sarah, I was just going to turn to you to give us a little bit more context. Are there newsrooms that are removing information? I mean, that seems to be the biggest concern that I hear, that information is just going to vanish. We're not going to have access to it. Not that we're making it more difficult to find, but that it's just simply going to disappear. Is that the reality in other newsrooms? Or, Sarah, are you seeing those newsrooms follow similar approaches and they're just de-indexing, though keeping these stories online for their staff and others to see?
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to bring up. So there actually are some newsrooms that are deleting. And I also agree with, Jason and Dan that it should be de-indexed. And it's important to know that also just as easily as things are de-indexed, they can be re-indexed. So Dan said, if 10 years later someone runs for city council, just pop it back on the search engine. So I think that, the original question, should it be right to be forgotten? I think it should be right to be de-indexed. And, that's important not only for, even if a story in and of itself seems like a one-off and it's not that important. I'm actually part of, I'm continuing my research past grad school with this thing called the Magic Grant that's through the Brown Institute with Columbia and Stanford. And there's actually a separate project that is examining, crime reporting from the 70s and looking at a bunch of different newspapers and how they, did that and looking at racial biases. So for stuff like that, that's really important that you keep these stories up.
Jason and Dan, I know you said that your respective programs, they're continuing to be fine-tuned. But do you expect that there'll be any challenges in the future as this idea of newsworthiness and what makes an article newsworthy, particularly when it's compared to reputational harm that it might be causing? That may change over time. The considerations that you're making now, the decisions that you're making now may be different than what you make 10 years from now. Is this just going to be a continually evolving process, or ultimately are you looking for some kind of more formalized program that sets out some, journalistic boundaries as to what you're going to continue to index it or publish?
Well, yeah, I would say I would continue to evolve over time. And, we're prepared for that with the Fresh Start program. I mean, we know that we have a pretty good framework coming into this program, but it's still very new. And we want to be flexible and, adaptable. We're going to learn a lot, and we're going to learn a lot of things that we don't know right now. But I would also say that that's actually not any different from how newsrooms have operated forever. I mean, we've always had these discussions about what's newsworthy, what we cover, how we cover it. And I think this is just, an ongoing evolution of that conversation, just, adapted in a different form.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we intentionally kept our guidelines pretty vague because we wanted a lot of freedom to be able to adapt and change as we learned more about what was working and what wasn't with the process. I will say that also what we consider to be newsworthy now is different than what it was 20 years ago. We don't publish lists of indictments. We don't do a ton of cop briefs. We do publish public safety news when it has to do with, if it affects people's lives or if it's very serious. We don't really publish mugshots anymore unless it really is necessary for some reason. One example I can think of a time we did publish a mugshot when it was necessary was the manhunt that ended for the guy who killed a cop in Maine, and he had a black eye, and part of the defense was that one of the things the defense was saying was that he had been hit by cops. So obviously that mugshot mattered. But anyway, so that's an example of just some things that we've already changed about how we approach crime coverage anyway. We've become more selective. Part of that is because it's better journalism. Part of that is also because, frankly, we just have way fewer people in the newsroom than we did 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah, it's a great point, and actually, it was just posed by someone in the audience. The idea that here we are talking about programs that are going back and essentially changing or modifying news coverage. But Dan, you're talking about how these programs are making your newsroom reassess future news coverage and really prompting you to make some additional changes into the way communities are covered. Jason, have you seen similar changes being made in the Globe's newsroom, or how do you anticipate, if at all, the Fresh Start initiative making those that are currently covering crime in the community rethink how that coverage should occur and what types of stories should be published?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a factor in that. I mean, we've been having discussions about public safety and police coverage, sort of ongoing, even separate from Fresh Start. To Dan's point, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a mugshot on bostonglobe.com today as well. But I think Fresh Start and the process going through it has definitely caused us to think about how we've covered things in the past. And yeah, I mean, I think it will going forward. I mean, I was in a conversation about a story a couple of weeks ago where one of the things I raised was, is this the type of story that we can envision taking down with Fresh Start, a couple of years from now? And if so, should we be covering it, or should we be covering it in this way? So it's definitely I'd say it's part of a broader conversation in our newsroom.
Sarah, can you help us understand that broader conversation that I think most newsrooms are having right now about how to cover crime moving forward, regardless of whether or not they have a similar type of, Fresh Start program in place? What types of conversations are you seeing newsrooms have now because of these issues and concern over reputational harm?
I haven't talked to folks directly about what they're doing, but just from what I've been reading, and part of my guidelines that I intend to put out exactly would also cover moving forward. So you can, I'm sure that there's always going to be some one-offs, but the goal in the end is to cover things in a better and more holistic way. But yeah, really, I think the inequalities in our country, who's getting arrested more often than other people, are you going to follow through with that crime coverage? If you just write a one-off, do you have the resources, or do you have the intention of showing up to the court and following it all the way through? If not, why do you need to cover this? Mugshots are a huge thing that, I think a lot of newsrooms are having outside, even before George Floyd. There still are some that publish, and I get that it's really tricky because sometimes that's like the cash cow for a newsroom. But it's definitely, something important to consider when just, thinking about how people perceive others.
Thank you. I'm getting a number of questions about coverage of the courts in particular. And I know not necessarily for your organizations, but for newsrooms generally, really battling with, fewer staff members, the less capacity to cover crime in their communities. Dan and Jason, could you talk specifically about your newsroom's coverage of what is happening in our courts, coverage of court hearings, proceedings, and whether or not having the ability to follow those cases through the system and report on them every step of the way is a consideration, or more of a consideration that you're giving to your coverage?
We try to cover crime stories that we know we will at least close the loop on at some point. Admittedly, we don't always do that. We just don't have, some stories slip through. Some weird thing could happen that's, really bizarre, that is news that day, and then we kind of forget about it. This stuff happens, and then we don't close the loop until much later. But that has been part of our policy on crime coverage for a while, is that, when we're balancing what to cover, we have to think about whether we would actually go through with it, cover this until the end. Going back to the mugshot thing, we try to, if we're going to publish a mugshot, then we try to at least get into the courtroom to get a photograph of the person when they're at least not, they might, be able to wear a suit and a tie or dress, present themselves in a more humane way. Yeah.
How about with the Globe, Jason? Has coverage of what's happening within the courts themselves, is that changing given all of the considerations that you're now discussing with Fresh Start?
I mean, it's a great question, and it's something that newsrooms have wrestled with for decades, really. I mean, we've never had the bandwidth to cover every single court case, that's coming through the greater Boston area. Yeah, I do think we are a little bit more in the situation where you look to sort of pick and choose the ones that are really going to matter and have high impact and interest in the community and really affect the community. That said, that's another aspect of Fresh Start where we do hear from a lot of people who urge us to kind of follow up and see how their original arrest or case may have gone through the courts and what the results were. That can lead to editor's notes and updates to the case. In some cases, charges were never brought, and that's a significant factor in considering the case.
Yeah, which brings up, I think, some really important considerations about how to best both cover a community and be a positive force in that community. Jason, you mentioned when Fresh Start was beginning and you were thinking about creating this program, you got a lot of input from various community members. Both you and Dan, if you could you tell us what kind of outside of the newsroom involvement people have in these programs, what kind of input you're getting from various community leaders, for example, to really help you better understand what's at stake with your news judgment. Dan, are you having these conversations with those outside the newsroom to better focus your efforts?
Not on an ongoing basis related to this, but we did. I did talk with Chris from the Cleveland.com when we were considering it to kind of go over the strategy and see how it aligned with what he was doing. We found that our policy was pretty much the same, except that theirs goes further. I think they actually delete stories more often. Yeah, so I mean, I would be interested to get more feedback from the community and talk to more people about what's working and what isn't as the program grows. Right now, it's still pretty, it's still nascent. So,
Jason, how about yourself? Do you have that direct line to the community as far as this program's concerned? Any plans on making sure that you have certain community voices involved in the process moving forward?
Yeah, so as we were designing Fresh Start, putting it together with the committee, one of the things we did is everyone in the committee conducted interviews with just a variety of people throughout the community. So, I mean, everyone from former prosecutors, journalism professors who are not affiliated with the Globe, community activists who represented sort of a, broad swath of the region, people who do Corey reform, people who work with domestic violence survivors. We really sought input from a lot of different people, and that proved to be really foundational to our approach. I wouldn't say it was directly changed anything, but all these perspectives really weighed in on how we constructed it. And to be honest, hearing all these perspectives was one of the things that really encouraged us to take the cases on a case-by-case basis rather than try to be too rigid, because each expert was kind of able to lend a different perspective on how things or how they would view cases from their area. It's having a sustained community outreach is going to be a really important thing for Fresh Start. I think that it's something we're committed to keeping the discussion going throughout the community, explaining to people in the community what we're doing and sort of what the opportunity is here. And so, that's something we look forward to doing going forward.
Sarah, of the programs that you research, what kind of community involvement is there? Were there community leaders involved in the process of creating these programs? Are they sitting on the actual committees that are making the decisions? What does it look like outside of these two newsrooms?
Again, the Globe is the only one that I heard of that is actually reaching out to the community, and I think that's really important. And I also think it's important that the people reviewing the cases look like the community, right? So, most of the time, another conversation that newsrooms are having is that leadership is often looks a lot like you men. Nothing wrong with that, but to make it look a little bit more diverse so that people really understand or have a better cultural understanding of where inequalities come from is really important.
Sarah, let's stay on this topic for a moment as we begin wrapping up here. There may be people listening to this conversation who hadn't until now thought about having a similar program, or maybe they have something informal in place that they would like to formalize and publicize. Based on your research, what you've heard from Jason and Dan, what is the best way to start such a program? What are the most important considerations in doing so? And through your research, what have you found to be the best practices once these programs have been implemented?
Well, I think certainly talking to other newsrooms that have already kind of formed a program like this is important. I really, again, not to just praise the Globe every time, but I really think that, the approach of talking to the community is really important, because you have to, you're working for the community, you get that feedback. I think, looking at the crime statistics, knowing that Black and brown folks are, more likely to be arrested, indicted, all of that, just taking extra care that you're, reaching out to those communities, because, who's more, you have to think also who's more likely to read your paper and see those, advertisements that they could take things down. You want to make sure that you're reaching out. I know that Cleveland.com, obviously pre-COVID, would post flyers in courtrooms. So, just thinking about how can you really make sure that everyone who needs to see this is seeing this. And, there's so many like addendums to everything. Like I feel like one day I'm like, yes, this is great. And then I watch things like the QAnon docuseries and I'm like, oh my gosh, what if there's these like crusaders that try to like come and like undo this? I've thought of everything. But I do think that the cause is worthwhile. And I think it's worth having discussions and continuing to have discussions, because technology is changing so rapidly. And, we, as Jason said, like, we've always sort of evolved how we cover the news. And we just have to make sure that we're doing it in such a way that, is of the most benefit to society. And I also think it's really worthwhile to have like a continued network of newsrooms who are doing this, which is sort of what I'm trying to establish, to talk to one another, because obviously different newsrooms have different budgets. Bangor Daily News is not the same budget as Boston Globe. And you don't want it to be that, you're spending all your time doing this and then taking away from the reporting of today. So there's a lot of things to consider, but I would say don't shy away from it.
Thank you. All good guidance. Jason and Dan, because these programs have generated so much interest, has there been any thought to putting together some kind of regular report on the number of requests you get, what actions have been taken, some kind of public release of data as to how the program is being rolled out, and what types of decisions you're making for what types of stories, so the public has some degree of transparency with what's going on in your newsroom?
No, that's a good idea, though. I'll write that down.
Great.
We've talked about doing that internally, so that to communicate it throughout the newsroom, so that reporters and editors know what types of cases are coming in. But broadening it is certainly an interesting idea.
Excellent. And Dan, where can we find more information? I know you put a link in the chat box, but if we want to find out more information about the BDN's policy, what it looks like, how people can request to have their stories removed, there's the link right there. Those that might be watching this as a recording after the fact and don't have access to those links, how can they best access that information?
It's bangordailynews.com/forgetme.
And as you mentioned, you're the point person for this program. So if anybody has any additional questions, I imagine, are free to reach out to you personally and ask them.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'd love to talk about this.
Jason, how about the Fresh Start Initiative? Where can we find more information on that program?
It's on bostonglobe.com/freshstart, one word.
And are you the best person to reach out to with additional questions, even if just from editor from another newsroom who wants to hear how it's
Absolutely. Going? Happy to share and happy to talk through how we arrived at this process. And I'm eager to hear what other newsrooms are working on as well.
Now, Jason, Dan, I want to give you an opportunity in a moment just to share some final thoughts. But first, I want to start with you, Sarah. Given all your research, what you've heard today from Jason and Dan, the various types of programs that are in place, you've researched them. You've done the research. You've seen what works, what doesn't. In just a couple moments, can you give everyone just some final thoughts on what you've seen and what you would like to see moving forward?
Yeah, so I do think the deleting stories should be like just very, very special cases. I really think de-indexing is the way to go. And if you do make any changes, I think it's really important to keep a secure list of that somewhere, just in case something does change. You know, people they, you know, you don't know what their trajectory is going to be. Again, what I mentioned earlier about making sure that it's holistic, that you're continuing to talk amongst yourselves, amongst other newsrooms, with the community. Yeah, and I would love to talk to newsrooms that are interested in, you know, exploring this further.
And as far as your research, Sarah, is there a place online you can direct people to go to see the research you've done and get a better understanding of these types of programs?
There will be. So it's not finalized yet, but I am most likely going to be publishing my guidelines at Columbia's Dart Center. So just keep an eye out for that. And I'm likely going to publish an op-ed as well, probably in the Columbia Journalism Review. So probably within the next couple months.
Dan, before we conclude here, any suggestions for those newsrooms that want to have a program similar to yours, something in place that they can point to and encourage people to use if they feel like certain stories are painting them in a bad light, so much so that they should be de-indexed or, you know, modified somehow?
Yeah, you know, we're a small newsroom, and we try to be innovative and we try to move quickly. And I just want to point out that this didn't take a whole lot for us to get launched. It basically took some back-end tools and, you know, a Google form. So there's a lot that you can learn from what newsrooms are already trying. And I think that you can build on that. I mean, I'm lucky in that I had some other newsrooms that I could already build this on and just had to tweak it a little bit. Also, stay flexible. Don't back yourself into a corner. And, you know, I also think, just in closing, that part of covering a community is being able to defend your coverage to that community, right? So I try to always answer phone calls from people who are mad at us. In thinking about this issue, I realized that I was no longer able to come up with a good defense for why we couldn't take down old stories. Like, it just didn't make any sense. It was just stubborn because, you know, that's just what we'd always done. So I think that it's important for news organizations to think across the spectrum about what it is that they do and why it matters and how it's helping their community.
Thank you for that. And Jason, final words. You know, we know not every newsroom has the resources the Globe does, but perhaps there are some general principles or advice you could give that are universal, regardless of staff size, that you can impart on all of us.
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with everything Dan said. And I think one of the things I think I've learned since we launched Fresh Start in January is I've been kind of amazed at how many other newsrooms have reached out. And this really is an issue that, you know, is not specific to the Boston Globe, but it's something we're all wrestling with. And, you know, I do like the work Sarah's doing and the idea that, you know, together, you know, a lot of us talking about this, we can come up with solutions. Because it's not something that's unique to any one newspaper, you know, regardless of size. And, you know, again, just to echo what Dan said, I really do view this as an evolution in how we cover our community, you know, how we tackle these stories in a digital age in which technology is a lot more powerful and potentially harmful than it ever has been before. And, you know, this is a way to ultimately strengthen our relationship with our readers.
Well, Jason, Dan, Sarah, thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. I would encourage everyone here to reach out to Jason, Dan, and Sarah with additional questions. You know, they're very accessible and happy to follow up on any of the points that we discussed today. Again, I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. You can learn more about our organization at nefac.org, and feel free to reach out to me at justin@nefac.org. Jason, Dan, Sarah, thank you all again. And to everyone who joined us, thank you for taking the time to be here. We appreciate you being a part of the conversation and enjoy the remainder of the NEMPA convention. Take care, everyone.